They chained her, erased her name, and left her for dead until she returned in a billionaire's wagon and made the town remember every sin they tried to bury. The town of Dustwell was never loud, but on the day Mary vanished, it turned graveyard. Silent, the skies were clear, the wind slow, but the silence thudded in the air like gunshots unspoken. Mary had always been the shadow beneath the eaves, the barefoot girl with rope-burned wrists who fetched well water faster than a whistle. She belonged to the Barnetts, or so the law said. Though no one ever saw the paper, the law didn't need much paper to prove a black girl's chains in that part of the country. They just needed eyes that refused to see and mouths too afraid to speak. On the outskirts of Dustwell, past the chapel and the cemetery fence, the Barnett Ranch stood, like a scar on the land. Their barns were fat with wheat, and their horses fat with sugar cubes. But inside the back quarters, Mary's room was nothing more than a hay pile under the stairs. They'd whip her for blinking too slow, starve her for walking too fast, and every bruise on her back had a name: Silas, Mary Lou, Thomas. The entire clan took turns. Yet not once did she cry, not once did she beg. That unnerved them more than her disobedience. It was like her soul had fled somewhere deeper, someplace beyond reach. On the last day anyone saw her, a storm had gathered far west like a coiled beast. The Barnetts were preparing to travel south for a county fair, and Mary was tasked with scrubbing every boot and feeding every meal by sundown. But the sun dipped behind the cypress trees and Mary was gone. No footprints, no torn dress in the hedges. Just a coil of rope left behind, cut clean through. Sheriff Downs sent a few boys out to comb the rivers. Nothing. Reverend Abel asked the town to pray. They prayed. Then they moved on. Dustwell was like that. Memories didn't last long unless they wore a sheriff's badge or owned land. But the Barnetts were furious. They put out a reward offering $10 whole to anyone who'd return her, dead or alive. They claimed she was dangerous, a thief, a manipulator. They told stories that painted her as a witch who poisoned cattle and flirted with the devil. The town folk didn't believe all that, but they didn't care enough to say otherwise. She was gone, and that made things easier. Weeks passed. Then months, her name stopped being said in church. The children stopped drawing her silhouette in the dirt. Even the Barnetts seemed to forget, as if they'd simply misplaced a shovel. But the truth was, Mary had vanished like smoke from a prayer candle, and nothing made Dustwell more nervous than a mystery left unanswered. Then, one Sunday morning, the ground shook before the church bell did. A wagon rolled in from the east trail, its wheels tall and lacquered in obsidian black. It shimmered like it didn't belong in Dustwell. Its horses were braided in red feathers and buffalo beads, with hides so glossy they caught the sun like mirrors. Perched atop the velvet seat was a girl, not just any girl. It was Mary, dressed in buckskin trimmed with eagle fur, with turquoise bands wrapped around her arms and a wide hat shadowing her face. But what silenced the town wasn't her return. It was the insignia on the wagon's side. Painted in gold leaf was the crest of the Cheyenne Nation's most elusive billionaire, a war chief turned cattle magnate whose name was spoken in hushed tones and courtroom oaths. Rumors said he owned land from Arizona to Arkansas, but no white man had ever seen his face twice. And yet, here was Mary, driving his wagon, sitting taller than the mayor's horse, wearing wealth-like armor. As she pulled the reins, the entire town turned to stare. The preacher dropped his Bible. The Barnetts stumbled out of the saloon, pale as linen, their mouths caught between curse and confession. No one spoke, no one moved, because in that single moment, every lie they'd whispered about her, every whip cracked on her spine, every meal stolen from her plate came crawling back from the past like a plague. Dustwell, for the first time in history, stood still. But Mary didn't glance left or right. She didn't flinch. She steered the wagon right past the church and up toward the ridge where the wind howled like it remembered every sin, and behind her wheels, the town's redemption had just begun, one hoofbeat at a time. They thought it was a ghost, a figment sent to shame them on the Lord's day. But the dust didn't lie. Mary's wagon left tracks as real as breath. It rolled across Main Street like a sermon that needed no preacher, carving judgment into the earth. And though her eyes never turned, her presence cracked every brittle truth that Dustwell had built its peace upon. For days, no one saw her again. The wagon vanished the same way she once had. But that silence wasn't comforting anymore. It festered. Questions bubbled in the saloon and fumed in the church pews. How did she come to drive the Cheyenne Billionaire's rig? Had she bewitched someone in the wilds? Did she return for revenge, or worse, justice? It wasn't until the mayor's boy, Nathaniel, wandered near the old blacksmith's lot that the rumors ignited. He claimed to have seen the wagon again, not moving, but parked under the shade of Widow Creek Ridge. No tent, no guards, no horses nearby. Just the wagon and the faint outline of smoke curling from an unseen fire. The boy didn't dare go closer. Even he, barely 10, knew there were things better left undisturbed, but Sheriff Downs wasn't one to leave mysteries be, especially ones. That made him feel smaller in his own badge. He mounted up with 2 deputies and rode east at dawn. When they returned at dusk, their eyes were empty and their voices dull. The sheriff said only one thing: don't bother her. She ain't the same girl. She's something else now. And that was enough to keep Dustwell on its knees. But not the BARNETTS. Silas Barnett, the patriarch with eyes like rust and a temper soaked in whiskey, refused to be humiliated by what he called a barefoot field rat with a borrowed crown. He gathered his sons, strapped rifles to their backs, and rode out one night, not to talk, but to reclaim. To remind Mary and the land where she came from. They didn't return. 3 days passed before a local trapper found their horses wandering near the ravine, saddles intact, eyes wild. One of the rifles was found jammed between rocks, the barrel bent. A blood trail led nowhere. And though no bodies were recovered, Dustwell understood the message. She had come back not with fire, but with fate. What they didn't know was that Mary hadn't vanished by accident. In the days before her escape, something ancient had stirred beneath the ranch. While sweeping the porch, she'd uncovered something buried shallow, bones wrapped in Cheyenne cloth, broken shackles clinging to their ankles. The land had swallowed. Secrets Mary had unearthed one. She didn't know who they were, but their presence gave her purpose. That night, guided by the pull of grief not her own, she ran through the brush, barefoot, bloody, starved, until she collapsed on the trail. And when the vultures came, so did he. They called him Tahoma, a name that rode on the wind long before gold touched this land. He was Cheyenne, yes, but more than that, he was the last son of a war chief and the heir to stolen acres. While railroads carved through his ancestors' hunting grounds, he built empires from what they discarded. And in the dark, when he found Mary shaking by the cedar roots, he didn't ask who she was. He simply said, "You remembered them, so now they remember you." She woke in a world the law had forgotten, deep in the hills where no white boot dared tread. There, the people healed her, fed her, taught her. Not just how to survive, but how to stand tall without needing to be seen. Tahoma didn't treat her like property. He treated her like a voice that had waited too long to be heard. And over the seasons, Mary became more than herself. She became a vessel of memory, of reckoning. She didn't learn to shoot. She didn't need to. She learned how to read land like scripture, how to speak with elders, how to sit in silence and let truth grow roots. And when Tahoma asked her one morning if she would return to Dustwell, she didn't answer. She simply packed the wagon, carved the Cheyenne crest into the panels herself, and rode west, not to burn the town, but to awaken it. Now the Barnett estate lay cold. Windows shattered, doors flung open by the wind. The townsfolk avoided the property like it was cursed. But beneath the porch, right where Mary had once slept among rats and splinters, a new pile of bones had surfaced, this time not old, and not wrapped in cloth. And the only clue left behind was a single turquoise band nailed to the porch beam like a warning. the town realized something then. Redemption wasn't always a choir of angels. Sometimes it rode a wagon. Sometimes it buried the past with it. The church bell hadn't rung since Mary came back. Not for Sunday prayers, not for weddings, not for funerals. It hung suspended in its steeple like a judgment the town wasn't ready to hear. Even the preacher, Reverend Abel, had taken to keeping. The doors shut, his sermons now whispered in private homes, far from the hollow pews and the creaking rafters that seemed to carry Mary's name like a hymn. People stopped walking alone after sunset. Mothers pulled their children indoors earlier. Storefronts closed before dusk. And though no one said it aloud, every man and woman feared the weight of their silence more than they feared the law. The dust well had always buried its sins deep beneath politeness and Sunday suits, but now the dirt was cracking, and ghosts were crawling out with names. No one dared ride out toward Widow Creek Ridge, but each morning. The wagon returned, parked just beyond the post office. Quiet and immovable like a gravestone, Mary never stepped down. She simply sat in the driver's seat, looking straight ahead, unmoved by stares, and touched by time. She wore feathers. In her hair now, eagle and hawk, symbols of tribes whose stories Dustwell had paved over. Her hands rested calmly on the reins, but it was her stillness that unnerved them. It was the way she looked, like she'd already heard everything they had to say and found it all wanting. Then one morning, a storm rolled, not of wind, but of paper. Postmaster Gerald stumbled outside with a sealed envelope marked in red wax. No return address, just a mark, the Cheyenne crest. He opened it, and within minutes, the whole town had heard. A land deed, legally filed, signed and notarized from the Dakota Territory. Dahoma had purchased nearly a third of Dustwell, including the Barnett estate, the livery stables, and the Eastern Grain Mill. Mary was listed not as caretaker, but as co-owner, not a servant, not a steward. A partner. That revelation shattered Dustwell louder than any gunshot ever could. In a town where a black girl had once been chained to a feeding post like livestock, she now held ownership over the very land that fed them. The men gathered at the saloon that evening, fists tight, eyes heavy with indignation. Their pride, long fed on control and legacy, now found itself eating crow. Some spoke of sabotage, others mumbled of curses. A few even prayed for divine intervention, but all of them, to a man, feared what would come next. They didn't wait long. 2 days later, Mary stepped down from the wagon for the first time. She wore a long brown duster that trailed the dirt behind her. Around her neck hung a pouch made from buckskin and stitched with red thread, a medicine bundle. Some said, while others whispered it held the names of the dead. She walked through the town square in silence, her boots thudding like war drums. She didn't glance at the sheriff's office, where Downs pretended to study papers that weren't there. She didn't look at the church where Reverend Abel stood pale as snow, wringing his hands. She didn't acknowledge the storekeeper who once denied her flour, nor the dressmaker who refused to sew her a coat when winter came early. She stopped in front of the town hall, and that's where she dropped the box. No words, no speeches, just a thud, the sound of reckoning in oak and iron. By the time Mayor Henson arrived, it was already open. Inside were ledgers, names, receipts, signatures, all of them tied to sales, auctions, and services rendered, all documenting the lives that had been bought and broken in Dustwell's quiet past, pages upon pages of chains written in ink. Most damning of all, the first entry bore the seal of the town's founding family, the Hensons themselves. That evening, the town gathered like vultures circling a secret, but no one dared remove the box. No one touched the papers. Mary sat atop her wagon once more, reins in hand. As the sun died behind the ridge, that night, the first fire started. It wasn't hers. A building burned, the old mill, long abandoned, but still owned by the Hensons. Townsfolk said it was an accident, a lantern knocked over. But others whispered that guilt burns faster than wood. The fire raged for hours, and not a single bucket was raised to stop it. When the ashes cooled, no one mourned, no one rebuilt. They simply avoided it, as if to erase the ruins meant erasing the history too. But Mary returned every morning. And slowly others began to follow. First, the children, drawn by curiosity, not fear. Then the elderly, their eyes clouded by years, but not blind to truth. One by one, people began to sit near the wagon. Say nothing, just sit, as if waiting for judgment, or maybe forgiveness. Destwell had forgotten how to grieve. Mary taught them again, not with sermons or vengeance, but with silence that cut deeper than any blade. Because when justice comes without shouting, without blood, and without chains, it lingers, and it forces everyone to look in the mirror. They buried long ago. By the fourth week, Destwell no longer resembled the town it once pretended to be. The children had stopped playing near the chapel. The drunks at the saloon now whispered with eyes cast low. The sheriff, who once strutted like a rooster with a tin star, avoided the center of town entirely, and the bell tower remained mute, as though the rope itself refused to be pulled in the presence of truth. The box Mary had placed outside town hall hadn't been moved, but it had been opened over and over again. Some did it under the cover of night, others in broad daylight, trembling fingers flipping through yellowed ledgers that documented decades of human trade. Every name listed once had a face. Some still did, others had died nameless in the fields beyond town or were buried in shallow graves behind barns now turned to dust. The more people read, the harder it became to walk down Main Street with pride. Because each entry in that box wasn't just an old mistake, it was a living bruise. Mary hadn't returned to lecture or punish. She had returned with proof. She had given Destwell a mirror it couldn't avoid, and yet some still clung to the old ways like a drowning man grips a rock. Not all hearts change at once. Mayor Henson, whose great-grandfather founded the town with coins soaked in blood, called for a private meeting among the town's elite. They met in the basement of the former schoolhouse, a place once built for white children only, though none of them spoke that name anymore. They feared that if they said it, the walls themselves might weep. The mayor proposed reclaiming their authority through legal action, to sue Tahoma, to strip Mary of ownership through loopholes, paperwork, accusations of trespass and fraud. But the town's lawyer, a man named Ellis Grier, shook his head before the mayor even finished. She owns it all, he said, voice dry like parchment. And she owns it clean. The deeds are valid. The land is hers. The truth is, we can't take anything. We already took too much. That silence in the room was heavier than shame. Meanwhile, up on Widow Creek Ridge, the Cheyenne came. Not an army. Not a threat, just wagons. Men, women, elders, children. They came slow, dignified, like rain returning to parched earth. Some carried offerings, painted hides, woven baskets, smoked fish and herbs. Others brought nothing but stories. They had heard what Mary had done, how she unearthed the bones, how she brought truth to a place built on forgetting. They came not for war, but for memory. Destwell had once belonged to their ancestors. And now, in a strange twist of time, a girl once beaten like a dog on its streets had made it theirs again, not through bullets, but through books and law. At first, the townsfolk stared from windows. But then something happened no one expected. Mary spoke. Not from a pulpit or a mountaintop. She simply sat on a wooden stool outside the barn, where the earth was dry and cracked, and began to read names aloud, one by one, from the ledgers. Each name was followed by a place, a trade, a price. She didn't explain. She didn't accuse. She just read, and the people came. They stood or sat or leaned against fences, listening. It became a ritual. Every dusk, as the sun bowed to the hills, she read the ledger of the lost. And as the names poured out like ash from a long dead fire, tears began to return to faces that had been dry for decades. An old white woman named Miss Cartwright approached her one evening. Her hands were trembling, and her dress was ironed to flat, as though she had dressed for confession. She placed a yellowed photograph in Mary's lap. A girl, maybe 8, with eyes like Mary's, but older. Mary didn't speak. She only nodded. The photograph was placed gently into the box, and the woman walked away lighter. One by one, they came, not to apologize, because Mary never asked for that, but to remember, to unearth their own pieces of the buried truth. But redemption doesn't come without resistance. Late one night, a fire was set near the barn. It lit the sides of the wagon, charred the edges of a dream. But it didn't spread. Rain came down just before dawn, sudden, fierce, as if summoned. When the sun rose, the wagon still stood, soot-streaked, yes, but unbroken, and beside it, in the dirt, were hoofprints not from horses, but bison. No one understood how they got there. But those who had listened, those who had cried, they believed that something larger had taken root in Dustwell. Something that wouldn't be silenced again. And in the fields behind the old mill, where the ashes had finally cooled, wildflowers began to grow, red and yellow, bold and defiant, the kind that bloom only after fire. At the edge of Dustwell, past the burnt husk of the mill and beyond the final row of dry sycamores, there was a riverbed that had long since dried up. Children had once played in it, running their fingers along the smooth stones and pretending they heard water. The elders said the river stopped flowing when the land started lying, when trees were cut, graves went unmarked, and names were sold like cattle. No one believed it, of course, but now even the children had stopped playing there, because Mary had gone there, not to speak, not to perform, just to sit. Each morning before dawn, she walked alone to the dry riverbed and waited. She didn't build a fire or bring books. She just listened to the wind. And each morning, someone followed. They didn't speak either. They sat on the opposite ridge, across the stones, and waited beside her. Sometimes it was a child, other times a mother. Once even Sheriff Downs, though he didn't stay long. Each visitor came with a memory or a burden, and left it there in silence. The place had become something sacred, not a shrine, but a threshold. A place where the townslies came to kneel. Meanwhile, news had traveled, not just to nearby settlements, but to cities and territories that had never even marked Dustwell on a map. Riders arrived asking for the girl with the wagon. Newspapers sent curious young writers to investigate. Even railroad officials came with gold buttons and promises, wanting to buy land to help her develop what they called this opportunity. Mary never answered them. Dahomey never even showed his face. Instead, the Cheyenne erected a monument at the edge of Widow Creek Ridge. It wasn't marble or stone, but cedar carved with symbols, feathers, and names. Not just their own, but the names Mary had read. From the ledger, they called it a listening tree. It bore no fruit, cast no great shadow, but when the wind blew through its carvings, it hummed. One day, a man came with dust on his boots and hatred in his eyes. He said he was a cousin to the Barnetts. His name was Kearney, and he claimed what Mary had done was theft. That she had no right to the land, no right to speak their names, no right to rewrite what God and men had already built. He rode up too, the wagon with a pistol at his hip, but before he could speak, the wind shifted. From the ridge came a line of riders, Cheyenne men, silent and broad-shouldered, each carrying nothing but a staff wrapped in cloth. They didn't point them, didn't threaten. They simply stood. Then came the townsfolk. First, the baker, then the preacher's wife, then the boy who had once seen Mary near the blacksmith's lot. They didn't shout or demand. They just stood beside the wagon, and when Kearney turned to gauge their faces, he found no support. Only the weight of a town that had grown tired of silence. Kearney left before sundown. Dustwell didn't follow him with words or bullets, only eyes. That night, Mary stood by the listening tree and lit a lantern made from elk hide. The flame inside wasn't bright, but it flickered steady. She placed it at the base of the tree and whispered a single word no one could hear. and then the river moved, just a trickle at first, a shimmer along the stones, but it was water, fresh, cold, undeniable. Children screamed and danced, elders wept. It was as if the land had forgiven something, or perhaps finally been heard. By morning, the flow had widened, not a roaring river, just a steady stream, enough to wash the dust from the town's boots, enough to begin again. And in that quiet triumph, the people finally understood Mary hadn't returned to destroy them. She had returned to remind them that justice doesn't always come with fury. Sometimes it comes with roots, with wind, with water. With names that must be remembered, with silence that demands to be answered, and redemption, it turned out, wasn't a fire at all. It was a girl in a wagon, and a town that finally stopped lying to itself. The day the last name was read from the ledger, the wind stopped blowing. It was strange. Distwell had always known wind, sharp in the morning, dry at noon, moaning through the churchyard by dusk, but that day, it was still. Like the whole sky had paused, listening for something more. Mary stood beneath the listening tree, hands steady, voice clear, reading the name of a girl not much younger than she had been when the Barnetts bought her. The record didn't say much, just a first name, Etta, and the word traded. Scrawled beside it. I spoke the name like a prayer. Then closed the book, and with that, she placed the ledger in a hollow carved into the cedar trunk, wrapped it in cloth, and sealed the opening with a wooden plate carved in the image of a buffalo skull. Not to hide it, not to forget it, but to keep it safe, because what the town had learned was not just for them. It was for the future, and for those who never had the chance to tell their story. By then, the town had changed. Buildings still stood where they always had, but people walked slower now. Not with fear, with awareness. The postmaster greeted each visitor with gentleness. The sheriff, having resigned quietly, now worked tending horses. The mayor no longer gave speeches. And the schoolhouse had reopened, this time with both black and white children sharing desks carved by Cheyenne hands. Mary did not speak often, but when she did, her words settled in the bones of everyone who heard them. She had become more than a person. She was a presence, a reckoning, a reminder that no matter how deep a sin is buried, the earth will find a way to bring it to the surface. One morning, she returned to the river. The water now flowed like it had never stopped, clear, cool, and lined with smooth stones etched by the Cheyenne with symbols of healing. On its banks, women washed linens beside children laughing in bare feet. A fence had been built not to keep people out, but to protect the grove of wildflowers that now bloomed there, the same place where the ashes of the old mill had once choked the soil. She dipped her hands into the water, then rose without a word. Her eyes turned east, toward the road that led out of Dustwell, through the low canyons and into the lands where no maps were yet drawn. And just like that, she mounted the wagon. People gathered as she passed. Not to stop her, not to question, just to watch. The silence was different now, irreverent, as if the whole town breathed out through her departure. There were no tears, no goodbyes, just nods and hands over hearts. The wagon rolled slow through Main Street, the wheels creaking like old memories finally being laid to rest. The children chased behind her for a few paces, laughing until she waved, and they stopped, standing still, watching until she was a shape swallowed by dust. She never looked back. By sunset, the tracks were already fading, but something had taken root in Dustwell that would never vanish again. In the church, the bell rang once, not to signal an emergency or a wedding, but to mark the end of an era. The beginning of something else. The townsfolk would speak of her in hushed awe. For years to come, they'd say she rode a wagon built by hands that once carried spears. They'd say she turned a graveyard town into a place where names mattered again. They'd say she didn't leave us behind. She made us look ahead, and at the edge of Widow Creek Ridge, where the listening tree stood tall, the wind picked up again. It sang through the carvings, humming the names that once sat forgotten in the ledger. It brushed against faces that now knew what justice tasted like, not fire or fury, but peace, and somewhere, out in the open land between, Memory and horizon. A wagon rolled on. Its wheels carried more than a girl. They carried a history redeemed.